This is the Rational Reminder Podcast, a weekly reality check on sensible investing and financial decision-making from two Canadians. We are hosted by me, Benjamin Felix, and Cameron Passmore, portfolio managers at PWL Capital.
Welcome to episode 274. This is a different kind of episode. And honestly, Ben, it's kind of a different kind of season for us recording. We've been so busy traveling and doing a couple of live events. But today we get a chance to release the live event that we recorded in Toronto at the CFA Society Toronto's annual wealth conference, which was fun, and we'll talk more about that in the actual episode. Mark McGrath, of course, will join us again for Mark to Market. And then we get a chance to talk to Brittany Hodak, who wrote the excellent book, Creating Superfans, How to Turn Your Customers into Lifelong Advocates. And of course, after that, we'll jump into the Aftershow. Anything else you want to tee up, Ben?
I think that's a pretty good introduction. It's definitely a unique episode. I mean, we'll talk more about it when we get into introducing the segment. But it was a unique experience for us. We recorded this thing live, and it was about a little bit about what we've learned in the podcast, and then a little bit about what we've learned about podcasting from doing the podcast. Anyway, we'll talk more about it in the episode.
All right, let's go. All right, let's jump into episode 274. You want to kind of cue up this first part, Ben?
Yep. So in September, we were invited to be part of the CFA Society Toronto's annual wealth conference. And it was, incredible to be invited to that and incredible to actually participate in it. It's funny. I would never have guessed when we started doing this podcast that we would be invited to do something like that. So this is an event that was in downtown Toronto. There's probably 100 or so people in the crowd, all members of the CFA community, all people working in wealth and wealth adjacent fields or wealth service fields. And
a very well-run event. The other four other speakers and topics were very, very good, very interesting topics. I thought the day flew by for me. I thought it was just an exceptional event.
Yeah, that's right. So we sat through all of the other speakers, which were phenomenal. And actually, funny offshoot story. One of the speakers was the guy who writes the private equity chapter for the CFA curriculum. And so he did an excellent session on private equity. And I talked to him afterwards. It turned out he'd actually listened to our episode with Ludovic Philippou. And I told him we'd done a couple of other episodes on private equity. Now, this is a guy whose business is educating people about private equity, but he's not selling private equity funds, which is that's pretty rare to find somebody with that level of expertise in private equity who doesn't want to sell you products, which is one
passion.
of the reasons
he loves teaching it. He was very good.
Yeah, and this is why Ludovic was an amazing episode on private equity for the same reason. An expert in the field who doesn't have anything to sell. Yep. So I asked Steve Balaban is his name. I asked him if he would listen to our past episodes on private equity that he hadn't listened to yet because he'd already heard one, and then come on as a guest to kind of offer his counterpoints and critiques and whatever, and additional points we may not have thought about. So he agreed to that. So future episode, we're going to have him on, and that's going to be really, really cool. But that total side story, but that just came out of being at this event and hearing him speak and then talking to him afterwards. Anyway, back to the thing we're talking about here. So what we did for this event is that Scott Dickinson, who was on the organizing committee for the conference and is a listener of the Rational Reminder podcast, he's also a principal at Northwood Family Office. He actually interviewed us. So he sent us questions to ponder over, and then we answered them on this stage in front of a bunch of people. So it was stuff like, how did we meet? We talked a little bit about that. Where did the idea for the podcast come from? What were the early days of the podcast like? What else was there? A favorite guest, favorite episode,
favorite books, or recommended
favorite books, biggest lessons learned and takeaways after 5 years of interviewing some of the, which is, these are all really fun to think about, honestly. Regrets, that was an interesting one. Regrets from reflecting on the podcast. What do we wish we'd done differently? Anyway, I won't say all the questions because you're going to hear Scott ask them in a minute here. But it was neat. It was neat to do, neat to be a part of, neat to think about the questions that Scott asked for us. So I mean, that's it. I guess we'll go and play that interview and hope people enjoy it. As always, we appreciate any feedback.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Our next session is going to be a little bit different. So, there's the standard financial conference, PowerPoint presentation for 30 minutes and then 15 minutes of Q&A. This next session, we are going to try and record a live podcast episode on stage. Our next speakers are Cameron Passmore and Benjamin Felix, who are both portfolio managers at PWL Capital, and they are also the co-hosts of The Rational Reminder, which is one of the most popular finance and investing podcasts in the country. For the past 5 years, Cameron and Ben have educated their listeners, including myself, on a wide variety of topics. They've released hundreds of episodes, and they've interviewed some of the biggest and brightest minds in finance. And I'm going to use my sheet here so that I don't miss anyone. But some of the guests that they've interviewed over the past 5 years include financial writers Morgan Housel, Daniel Pink, Charlie Ellis, Annie Duke, and especially for the people in the room, Michael Kitsis. Personal finance experts Preet Banerjee and Rob Carrick, professors like Burton Malkiel and Eugene Fama, business leaders like Harley Finkelstein and Heather Reisman, hedge fund managers Cliff Asness and Ted Cetus, everyone's favorite Canadian astronaut Chris Hadfield, and last but not least, the mayor of Ottawa, Mark Sutcliffe, who they knew long before he was the mayor of Ottawa. So today we're going to do something a little bit different. They've had this podcast for 5 years, and they've always been directing the questions at other people. The goal of today is to reverse that and direct the questions back at them and learn and hear about what they have learned over the past 5 years of conducting all these interviews and diving deep into so many subjects. So because of that, and because we are recording a live podcast, we're not going to do wireless mics for this session. If you have a question, whether you're already familiar with the show or you hear something that makes you want to ask a question, write it down on the cue cards, pass it around to the CFA Society staff that will be circulating throughout the session, and it will be brought up to me so that I can ask the question. So without further ado, let's play the theme music and give them both a warm welcome. The full theme song is 90 seconds, so we decided to cut it short to not have that awkward space. But thank you both for being here today. We really appreciate it. How are you enjoying the conference so far?
Great so far. We're really happy to be here. Thanks a lot for inviting us. This is the CFA program and the local CFA Society in Ottawa have been important to me in my journey in financial services. So being asked to be here is great. Appreciate it.
And I thought Wally did a perfect setup for us talking about the next 50 years, because really what the podcast is about helping people tell their stories for the next possibly 50 years. So I thought that was a perfect setup.
Great. And as I said, they are both from Ottawa, so we really appreciate them taking the time to be here. I know you in particular do not like to get on airplanes for obvious reasons. So.
That's changing, though.
Oh, yeah?
It's changing.
They're changing the design of airplanes to make them more...
No.
No, I still don't fit on the airplane. No.
But yeah, really appreciate you guys coming. So why don't we just jump right into it? To set the stage for people in the room that maybe are not familiar with you or is not as familiar with the podcast, how many people are tuning in to an average episode of The Rational Reminder?
We estimate it's around 30,000 listeners. That's based on our downloads and YouTube views. So it's somewhere around there. Although it's probably a little bit more than that. There's 25,000 subscribers on our YouTube channel. Audio podcasts don't work the same way in terms of the data that you can collect, but it's probably between 30 and 50,000 individual listeners on a regular basis.
But what is interesting, people will often discover a recent episode and then go back through time. So even our early episodes still have quite a high number of downloads. You can tell people are going back. And as you know, we mentioned highlight prior episodes recently to kind of help people find, because now, like today, number 271 drops, so to help people decide what they might want to go back and listen to. So those are getting lots of spikes if we highlight an episode from 4 or 5 years ago.
And you also have a very engaged community on the Rational Reminder website. How many people are active contributors or members of that community?
Yeah, that's a good question. We have an online community with around 8,500 users, and on a regular basis, there are about 500 people who are actively discussing topics related to things we've discussed in the podcast.
Yep.
But the monthly visits are how many? 500,000?
Monthly paid views, yeah. Page views are around 500,000 on that website.
And I think you said you recently crossed 6 million downloads for the podcast. Is that correct?
Pretty close to that, yeah. It's about 2 million a year now. I think it's growing 10-11% per year.
Yeah. And Ben, you also have a YouTube channel. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, what that is, and kind of the growth that you've seen on that front?
Yeah, and maybe just real quick, because of the context of the conference, I think what we hope you will all take away from this conversation is that these social media properties between our podcast and the YouTube channel that Scott just asked me about have been super impactful to our business in the way that we communicate with clients and in what we've learned for what the service that we provide to clients. So that YouTube channel I started, I think six years ago, around there, and it's at 330,000 subscribers now, and that started to see a little bit of success 5 years ago, which is when we started our podcast. And because of that success, we kind of thought, why don't we try doing something like a longer form podcast? My YouTube videos are around 10 minutes long, so different format.
Well, we were listening to Animal Spirits, which I'm sure a number of people here know, and we're like, those are two guys that talk into microphones. We talk all the time, so why don't we just try it? It was nothing more complicated than that. Got a couple of mics and just tried. Had no idea what we were doing.
And I know there's one particular video, which maybe it's the kind of clickbait title that helps, but renting versus buying a home, the 5% rule has 4-point-something million views on YouTube.
Yeah, that one got a lot of views.
Yeah. So just wanted to put that out there. These are not just two guys recording a podcast in their garage, in their basement in Ottawa. There has been a global reach to this, and I think that's worth talking about too. Obviously, you're both Canadians, but as a listener to the podcast, there are people that it seems you have reached around the world. Do you want to just talk about some of the different countries or some of the different people that you've heard from past episodes?
Well, as you know, Scott, I put it out there to listeners to reach out on LinkedIn, and every week I hear from 5 to 10 people every week from all over the world. It's unbelievable. Different roles, different experiences, different ages. It's incredible who it connects with, and we see that we have a merchandise store, so we get orders for our hoodies, for example. We've shipped many to Australia, as one example.
It's only about 40% of our audience now is Canadian, which is actually not ideal from our perspective, because we one of the reasons we wanted to do it is to market to Canadians. So that's actually been
Not
a bit
a lot
of
of Australian clients coming.
Yeah, well, that's it. There are other benefits to that, but anyway, yeah.
Maybe that's a good segue. Like you mentioned how it's been impactful to the wealth management practice. Is the podcast directly profitable other than the fact that it has led to client lead generation?
Directly, no, because as you know, we don't monetize it other than getting leads from it. But the biggest benefit for us, I think by far, is to find talent. So many of our new team members in the past couple of years came from the podcast, people reaching out saying, like, I hear you guys, I relate to you, I trust you, I like the mission that you seem to be on, and that has been an incredible source of new talent.
That is absolutely true, but it does not hurt with business development either. I think it's our number one source of new leads.
Once we started putting it out there that we were open for business, we were so sensitive about being perceived as, hustlers, that we avoided any mention that we were open for business. We hardly even mentioned what we did, other than very briefly in the intro. As you know, Scott, we would never push. So now we put in what we call a call to action up front, and so far this year, it is our number one source of leads.
Kind of what Waleed was speaking about, a little bit of that Canadian humility coming out there.
Yes.
Why don't we go back to the beginning? First podcast episode came out August 3rd, 2018. That episode was titled, "The Cheapest Advice Probably Isn't the Best," which I think is a sentiment that a lot of people in this room would probably agree with. Do you ever go back and listen to that? And is there part of it that is cringe-inducing hearing those early episodes?
All of it is cringe-inducing. I do not go back. I tell people when I get a lot of questions from people who want to start a YouTube channel, more so than a podcast. And they talk about how they feel nervous in front of the camera or they feel rigid in front of the camera. And I tell them, go and watch my first videos. It's embarrassing. I keep them up, but it's embarrassing. Yeah, so time in front of the camera and the microphone, I think, helps a lot.
Yeah, I never listened to what we call us episodes. There's just Ben and I, but I often listen to the other guest episodes. The guests have just been sensational. And as you know, we stay out of their way, ask very short, very tight questions. So I will go back and listen to many of them often.
And when this started, like we're August 2018, kind of just over 5 years ago, did you have any idea or any vision for what it would turn into here in September 2023?
No, none at all.
Well, it wasn't the goal, though, because back in the day, we used to have an annual client event, where we would fly someone in at great expense across the country or across North America, put them up in a hotel, have a ballroom like this, serve food. The event would cost us, $10,000 or $15,000. I'm sure many people here have done similar things. So our goal was, if we can reach 100 people a week, that'd be great. And the cost is almost nothing other than our time. And so we quite quickly got to 100, 200 people an episode, so that was deemed to be worthwhile.
And how did the two of you meet, and whose idea was it to start a podcast originally?
Well, it took a while after we met before we started the podcast. But
Yeah.
we met once at a networking event, and Cameron wanted me to call him back, and I never did. And
He never did.
He gave me grief about that the second time that we met. But I had started in financial services. I was working for a mutual fund dealer. I discovered the whole idea of index funds and low-cost investing. Through that, I discovered dimensional fund advisors, and I called them and asked if I could use their products at the dealer that I was at. And they actually laughed at me at the time and said, no, we don't deal with that firm. And then they called me back 6 months later and said that there was a guy in Ottawa who's got a practice using dimensional funds and asked if I wanted to be connected with him. And that was it. That's how we met.
But yeah, you did not call me back the first time I met you.
Yeah, that's how we met
You
the
were so
second
ahead
time.
of that. So.
And
But you were not who you are today back then either. I mean, you've come a long way in terms of your research and ability. So it's been an incredible decade of us working together.
I'll take that as a compliment. Yes.
And the podcast, whose idea was that?
I think I walked into Cameron's office and said, let's do a podcast. And Cameron said, okay, let's do it. And we bought microphones and we started doing it.
Yeah, I knew I didn't want to do YouTube. I was too afraid of that. So the podcast seemed easier.
Yeah. And in those early days, like we were talking a little bit over breakfast today on startup costs and the equipment. Like you guys have obviously high-end audio, now high-end video equipment. For people that are interested in introducing this for their wealth management practice, what does the upfront investment look like?
Probably in the zone of $5,000 to $10,000 per setup, depending if you're going to go on YouTube and have the camera. The camera's expensive. You can spend a lot on a backdrop if you want, but you could do it on the cheap as well if you wanted to.
Well, we didn't do video for our podcast until episode 101. So we did 100 episodes audio only, which in hindsight, I mean, I think that's one of the questions you might ask is about regrets or mistakes. That was probably a mistake in hindsight if we could go back and do video from day one, because the growth in viewership on YouTube has been incredible relative to audio, but we didn't start until much later.
Yeah, it would have been nice to have had Ken French episode 100 on video, for example.
Just missed it.
Just missed it.
And I've always just, out of personal curiosity, I've been fascinated by the people that listen to long form or watch long form content on YouTube. For example, my routine with podcasts is working out, commuting, always doing something else. I can't imagine sitting down and watching an 80-minute interview on YouTube in most cases, but it sounds like there's an audience out there for that kind of content.
I don't get it either, to be honest with you. I'm like you. I listen to podcasts while I'm doing other stuff. But yeah, there's a lot of appetite for long-form content. People watch.
But you called this, because I'm the one that wanted it short, 30 to 45 minutes, because that's the cadence that I was listening at the time. And you kept saying, forget about the length, it'll be as long as it will be. So you were dead right that people do have an appetite, especially when you get a guest that you're engaged in their research, engaged in what they want to deliver to you. Like, we go in well prepared for these interviews, right? And when you engage with someone who's put their life into this research, They want to talk. Like we had Cam Harvey, as an example, world-renowned economist. He was 2.5 hours, and he would have kept going if we didn't have to go for dinner or something. It was long. It was fantastic, though.
Yeah.
Gene Fama, same thing.
Yeah. Tell the story about, you mentioned that at dinner last night. But
so we had a chance to, everyone knows Professor Eugene Fama, Nobel laureate. He can be, I've met him a number of times, he can be gruff a bit.
Yeah.
And we got a chance to interview him on Good Friday in the morning, because he only works in the mornings, right? And his advice was, okay, check in with him at an hour. You get an hour, but about 5 to, see if he's having a good time and how long he'll let you go. And so Ben asked him, he said, let's keep going. So we got 62 questions in, because his answers are very sharp, in hour and a half. I mean, it's just an incredible interview.
Yeah. What is the longest episode? Is it Cam Harvey? Have you gone beyond that?
It's got to be, I think.
Yeah. Interesting.
But we've had many now that go hour and 20, hour and a half. Now we speed it up a bit, so we speed it up by 10%. So that makes
you speed up the audio.
Yes.
Okay. Since we're talking about guests, favorite episode, favorite guest. Maybe we'll start with you, Ben.
It is tough. It is tough to choose one because we have had conversations with some incredible people. I mean, Robert Merton was amazing. Gene Fama was incredible. Ken French, John Campbell. I don't know if did people recognize these names? They're big academic financial economists. My favorite though, and I do have a favorite, with apologies to everybody else, I guess. But John Cochran, who is an economist was at the University of Chicago for many years. Now he's at Stanford. He's done incredible work on asset pricing and portfolio theory, which I think is directly applicable to the work that a lot of us do. And he's done a lot of practical application work stemming from that. And so we did one episode with him on that, on portfolio theory, that was, for me, just incredible. I mean, almost transformational in the way that I think about what we as a profession do. And then we did a second episode with him on, he's just finished a significant book called the Fiscal Theory of the Price Level, which is a theory of inflation. So we again spent an episode with him on that. And those two episodes for me were just incredible. The amount of work that we put into preparing the questions for them was, I mean, maybe that correlates with how good the episode was. I don't know. But those two episodes of John Cochran are my favorites.
And we also hit a vein of academics in behavioral finance, and people like Katie Milkman wrote the book How to Change, Eilert Fishbach book Get It Done, but there's a whole cohort where they're all friends. They introduce us to each of them. That's how we met Hal Hirschfield, who wrote the book Your Future Self. So there's a whole vein of incredible people down there that completely changed how we think about so many things. If I was to pick a favorite, I'd have to go with Chris Hadfield, which was a surprising, not that we were surprised in him, but surprised at how great that episode did relate to the rest of our content. Goal setting, some great career advice in there. It was also one of the episodes with the lowest initial downloads. We actually had to go back, as you know, and tell listeners, look, you got to go listen to this. It was really good, and he was spectacular.
The nerds weren't interested.
The nerds, as soon as it's like Canadian astronaut, they were out.
That's actually worth going into because you do have a diverse audience base. You do have the people that want the deep dives and the financial research and really arcane specific topics. And then you have a group of people that are more interested in the broader stuff, like the Chris Hadfield conversation. How do you balance those two?
I don't know. We try and do a balance, I guess. We do deep dive topics, and we have deep dive guests in pretty geeky topics. But then we also do, like, Cameron reviews books in some episodes, and that's, I think, more accessible to a general audience. But the feedback that we get is that people who don't understand the really geeky topics still like to listen to it because they're trying to push the boundaries of what they know. And then people who like the geeky topics also like the less geeky stuff. So we seem to have a reasonably good balance of geeky and less so.
But it has to be what you love doing, because it's too much work to not. So I think it starts to reflect with this many episodes what we're both interested in. I mean, everyone knows Ben's geekier than I am. He's the intellect in terms of all the academic research, so he owns that. He loves that. I mean, some of the topics that we've talked about lately. We just interviewed Brittany Hodak, who wrote the marketing book Superfans. We interviewed Matthew Dix, who wrote the book Storytelling. This is not geeky academic finance stuff, but a lot of our audience is in the business, is interested, and I hear from a lot of people, because we have a reading challenge, that they get inspired to read more. Check out of their phones a bit, to someone's question here earlier. Check out of your phones and check into books and try improving your life. That incremental that Chris Hadfield talked about, every day, just incrementally get a little bit better. So that's our goal.
Do you want to just talk about the reading challenge and what that is?
So it's just an idea I had January 1st last year. I reached out to Angelica, who in charge of our marketing group, and said, what about a reading challenge, like some sort of inspiration to get people to read more? So Angelica found an app. You can sign up, you can join the group. I think we have 700 people in the group, and we called it last year 22 and 22, so 22 books and 22. This year, 23 and 23. And there's a whole community. I think Ben and I each have probably 400 people directly connected to us. You can see what people are reading, what they're reviewing, and lots of people reach out to me directly, perhaps you too, Ben, just to say how much they appreciate it and they love getting ideas of what else to read. So now we got people sending in book ideas. And it's also kind of cool because you can leverage that to get interesting guests. And now for the book review segment I'm doing, I'm actually reaching out to authors to come on for a quick 20-minute hit on their book, which is really interesting, really fun. Like we have Morgan Housel coming up soon on his new book. Shane Parrish has a new book coming out. He's already in the queue. So we got a lot of interesting people that, with the platform and the interest, that you can get some really cool people.
I think the reading challenge speaks to something bigger with the concept of having a podcast, though, which is that there's a whole community. I mean, we have the explicit online community, but there's a whole community of people who are interested in the stuff that we're talking about, and they therefore have shared interests, and that becomes a pretty interesting pool of people for us to communicate with.
Well, this is something Patrick O'Shaughnessy, I'm sure people know him from Invest Like the Best. There's something about the auditory experience. Like you either like our voices or you don't, but if you do and you kind of like the characters, it does really become this tight community. And like I heard we talked about this on the podcast a couple weeks ago, introduces to a friend of mine. He had no idea we were doing this. He's absolutely blown away. And he's a firefighter sharing the content with or my brother, another story, is a firefighter in the eastern townships of Quebec. And so one of his colleagues, a francophone, was an active listener. My brother didn't even know I was doing the podcast. So he finds out from this other guy, just did a name connection. So you just never know who's actively listening and engaged.
Speaking of Patrick O'Shaughnessy, when he's kind of been asked the best episode of his podcast or the one that he enjoys the most, he described it as, what are the episodes that people are going to be going back to 10 years from now and revisiting or discovering for the first time? I know you mentioned John Cochran, Chris Hadfield. Are there any others that stand out that you think have that kind of staying power?
Gerard O'Reilly, co-CIO of Dimensional. I've listened to that one many times. Eugene Fama, Ken French, Charlie Ellis, Mayor Statman we just had on was fantastic. David Booth, who founded Dimensional, from a business standpoint, that was excellent too.
I do go back to the John Cochran episodes a lot, but Cameron also mentioned earlier, we had this whole vein of guests, or a whole cohort of guests on happiness and well-being, and I think it relates to Barbara's talk this morning.
Yep.
That the research that we spoke about with those guests became a really important part of our wealth management business and the way that we deal with clients. So I definitely refer back to those episodes or the research of the guests that we had in those episodes. That was really, I think, transformational to the way that we set up our client relationships and communicate with clients.
And when you're getting in front of these people or asking people to come on the podcast, obviously it gets easier with the growth of the podcast, but how have you gotten some of these big, bold print names in academic finance to just come on for an hour?
We just ask. It does get easier, though, when we have a big list of past guests who are pretty big names. Early on, I guess we just got a little bit lucky with, I guess we had some podcast episodes out, and I know we had one of our first somewhat big name guests. He said that, you know what, I went and listened to some of your episodes and they're really good. I'm happy to come on. So that helped. But it builds. It snowballs. Now when we ask a guest to come on, we send them an email that lists some of the past guests, and it's like, it's everybody. So everybody says yes.
But you start asking friends, like we're friends with Larry Swedrow and Rick Ferry and Dan Solon and people like that. And then you ask them for introductions. So like Larry gave us an introduction to Cliff Asness at AQR, which was great. So every little bit, you just kind of scratch and get that breakthrough. And then we reached out to Ted Seides of Capital Allocators, and we share production team in the background. So that was kind of the intro. And he said, I get asked all the time, but maybe that's who you were referring to. So yeah, I listened to your stuff. You guys are okay. So he's become a friend of ours since then. And then a friend of ours in New York City knows Jill Schlesinger, who's the personal finance person for CBS Morning News. So we got to meet Jill, and she was just on with her new book a couple months ago. So you just keep, and we're living this, right? Like you have to be keen to be aware of what books are coming out, and it also becomes a bit of a race, right? Because a lot of our guests will go on like Masters in Business with Barry. So we're trying to get in the queue, kind of competitive to try to beat them. We also did a trip to New York City where we interviewed Barry, Dr. David Blitzer from S&P, which is another fantastic interview on the history of indexing. But again, it's who knows who, and just ask.
And Barry being Barry Ritholtz of Ritholtz Wealth, who I think is probably an American similar style to what you guys are trying to do on the podcast front. Like I know they have a series of podcasts you mentioned. I don't know if I'm supposed to share this, but they're thinking about rolling out some more podcasts in the next couple of months. So it is a bit of a different strategy that not a lot of, whether it's RIAs in the US or independent wealth managers in Canada, are pursuing what you guys are doing.
It's hard though. It's a lot of work. It's a major time commitment, not just preparing, but finding the people, booking the people. Like we do it all ourselves. We don't have booking agents. We don't deal with like even inbound requests coming from agents. We all but one we've turned down, and that one we, in hindsight, might have passed on.
No names.
No names. It's just you don't want to just be on the circuit, right? Just welcoming authors, and so many guests show up and they're like, "You actually read the book." Well, of course you read the book, but they're so used to just being a name to plug to plug a podcast.
To clarify, I also read Waleed's book. That wasn't just interviewing him. In terms of dream guests that maybe you haven't been able to book yet, is there anyone that stands out?
Let's see. I mean, Danny Kahneman would be cool to have. Myron Scholes, Bill Sharp, Dick Thaler would be pretty cool. We think we have a line to Dick Thaler because he's co-authored with Cass Sunstein, who was just on. Another phenomenal guest. Really nice guy, too. Anyone comes to mind for you?
The one that we regret is Markowitz. He was kind of right in there with the type of people that we've had on the podcast, but he's obviously passed away, so that was a shame.
Yeah.
And, similar to what Barbara said earlier, are there ever interviews that just don't go the way that you think they're going to go, and you just decide it's not worth releasing this because this is not what we thought we were going to get out of this person?
We've never not released an episode, but once we had to heavily edit in post-production.
No names on that one?
Yeah,
too?
no names. But it was usually that doesn't happen.
And one episode had a lot of backlash, which really shocked us. So people accuse us of having like political motivations, and I have no idea Ben's political. We've never spoken politics ever.
Do you want to start today?
No, I'm good. But we had a lot of backlash on this episode about diversity and equity. We were shocked by it because I thought it was a really nice episode. My fiance loved it, and we're not trying to annoy anyone. We're trying to learn. We generally just want to learn.
I think it's worth bringing that kind of incident up because you're a pretty mild-mannered guy, and that's probably as heated as I've ever heard you on the podcast. So do you want to just give a bit of background about what the topic was and what the backlash was?
The guest was a feminist talking about the state of the world for women
and money
and money and how those things relate to each other. And like Cameron said, we thought it was fine. It was interesting. And we did hear from a lot of women afterwards that it was a great episode. But there were a group of very vocal, very angry men. We're going to get backlash again for this episode. Thanks. Thanks, Scott.
Glad that I could join the team.
That was ugly. I mean, that's about as ugly as we've seen our podcast community get ever.
But if you don't like it, why did you listen? I don't understand.
I don't know. We got to stop talking about it.
Yeah.
The backlash,
which is
only
sad.
growing.
Which is sad that
Yeah.
that's the result of the feedback that we got on that episode. But yeah.
And in kind of a similar vein, are you guys ever, like, one of our most famous Canadian exports, Drake, has a line where he says, 7 a.m. in Germany, can't believe that they've heard of me. Are you guys getting recognized in public, airports, different places? And is that exciting, surreal, weird?
Yep. Yes, it happens. And yes, it is exciting, surreal, and also weird.
But it's kind of fun to get feedback. Like I was at Costco a few months ago and someone recognized me. And you get a chance to ask, what do you like about it? And so you get some feedback from people. So it's pretty, it's nice to see it has an impact, which was the ultimate goal, right?
Yeah. So still on the fun side of fame. It hasn't hit that.
Well, it's
crescendo
not that,
where-
like, I'm talking one episode, right? This is hardly a regular event.
Yeah, we're not that famous.
pretty niche
that
topic,
famous,
I
no.
guess. You're not quite putting up Justin Bieber YouTube numbers, even with 4 million.
Yeah.
We do have a couple questions from the audience. I'm going to go to one now. Our firm just launched a podcast. What advice can you offer for us to succeed?
I think one of the reasons that we've had a little bit of success with our podcast is that we've been consistent. We committed to doing this from day one when we started, and we've done an episode every week since. Never missed one, and they come out at the same time every week. And I think that's huge. I think it would be very difficult to build an audience without that consistency. So that's probably the number one piece of advice that I would have for anybody starting a podcast.
Yeah, the vast majority don't last more than a month, I think. People start and quit pretty quickly, but you have to love doing it. Otherwise, you're not going to do it.
And I think the other thing that's worth talking about is just the work, is the amount of time that you guys are both putting in to each episode. And maybe just talking to that, you obviously have other facets of your jobs. What % of your day, your week, your year is on the podcast versus the rest of your roles at PWL?
Well, it's interesting because we're doing a lot of this work already, like searching out people and reading books. So it's part of a way of living. But directly for the podcast, it's at least 10 to 20 hours a week, minimum.
It's tough to separate it out, though.
Yeah,
like
I know.
My job title at PWL is head of research, and so I'm doing the research anyway. What's the extra time specific to the podcast? I think that's a lot harder to articulate.
But for a John Cochran type episode,
Yeah, but like you said, I wanted to read his research anyway.
He's
I was
reading,
reading
he's reading that on the weekends. It's fine.
It's true.
I mean, it's true, right? I know you're not supposed to work after hours, but we will often chat many times through a weekend.
Yeah. Because it's the stuff you would be doing regardless
Anyways.
of the podcast.
Right.
I do have some good news for you from one of the audience questions. I was not expecting this, but hopefully this helps justify the trip to Toronto. I'm not going to say the person's email address, but it says, I can put you in touch with Bill Sharp. So
Awesome.
there you go. Hopefully that leads to a future appearance on Rational Reminder. I don't want to get clickbaity, and I know we've talked about the title here, but if you could distill the last 5 years into a couple of sound bites, like your biggest takeaways, your biggest lessons, what would they be? And maybe I'll start with you, Ben.
Yeah. So one of the big ones is that there is no optimal investment strategy. We think about that a lot professionally, but we've talked to so many experts with expertise in different areas of finance and financial economics and implementation of financial products, and nobody agrees on the optimal portfolio. So I think trying to pursue that is probably not going to be fruitful. One common thread, though, among all of the many academics we've had on our podcast is that I don't think any of them have disagreed with this. As a starting point for portfolios, low-cost index funds are pretty great, at least as a starting point. And that's something that I find interesting because we've talked to all of these academics and they generally agree on that. In the world of practice, I don't think you find quite as much agreement. So that's one big thing. The other thing is about happiness and well-being and how that intersects with financial advice. I like we listened to Barbara this morning, and I thought that was great. There's a model that we've learned about through doing the podcast called the PERMA model. positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. And I think having a model like that as an aspect of the advice that we're giving to people when they're making financial decisions is really important. So that's when I talked earlier about things that have changed our business. That's a big one, where we're not just trying to find the maximum Sharpe ratio for clients. We're trying to help them make good decisions that improve their more holistic well-being. So that's something that we've learned a ton about from doing the podcast.
The other thing too is a testament to the intro that you wrote 5.5 years ago. Sensible investing and financial decision making. This is all about decision making, and if you think about it, going back to Waleed this morning, it's all about life is about making decisions. So that's what we do every week, is try to find information to help people make better decisions, and there's an appetite for that. And a lot of people do like long-form content. I believe a lot more people should want long-form content. You heard us talk last week about, you did work, deep dive 2 weeks ago that referred 23 different studies, which who knows how much time you put into it, but in 30 minutes, you can hear Ben's take from 23 different academic studies. I would argue that's a worthwhile investment of time to help you make better decisions.
And probably more than 30 minutes went into that, I'm guessing.
Oh, yeah, a little bit more. I think another big one is, like, there's stuff that we've learned. Like, there's stuff on portfolio theory and on well-being that we've learned that helps us in our practice. I think about podcasting, we've also learned a lot of stuff. People want to talk about their research. People who have done a lot of work on a subject. I mean, this event today is a testament to that as well. People want to talk about the work that they've done. People who have done work in academia typically want to help people with that work, and so they're excited to talk to practitioners. So that's been an interesting thing to learn.
And even though we've talked about some of the big names we might have interviewed, some of the greatest guests are people you've never heard of that are just so happy to be asked, and were unbelievable. Like we had Itzhak Ben David a couple weeks ago. I think this was his first podcast. That's who it was. He was fantastic interview. Scott Cederberg changed how we think about markets with his long-term capital markets research. He's not a household name, and those finds that Ben digs up are unreal.
Do you want to talk about your personal reading habits? We talked about the reading challenge, but maybe that's contributed to it. But how do you find time? There's a lot of busy professionals in the room listening. What do you do to find time to read?
I make it an atomic habit. So five or so years ago, I had lunch with a client, and I was blown away that he had read, I forget the number, but like 20 or so books. I was blown away because I might have read 2 or 3 books, and just decided 45 minutes every morning, and I swear it's not much more than that. And I just finished book 48 of the year. So that's not to brag. It's just if you do 45 minutes, you're going to do a book a week. That's just, most books are like 260 pages, and 4 or 5 hours, they just happen. And I do it in my Kindle, so I take notes, feed it through Readwise, back to Evernote. I mean, everyone's got their own habit for capturing notes, but that's a big deal too, is to capture what you retain and have a mechanism to review it is really important.
Ben?
I don't really have any habits or hacks like that, but I will say that having something like our podcast, like I mentioned that I'm doing research anyway for my job, which is true, but having a podcast forces us, as long as we want to keep the podcast up, it forces a cadence of research. So we know that every week we have to either have read a bunch of research from a guest we're going to interview, or we have to have prepared our own research. We alternate between guests and presenting our own stuff. So that forces me to do a lot of reading. I don't have a hack though.
There is that constant pressure to make sure you keep up. Like, and if you're going to take a couple of weeks off, you have to make sure you got some work in the bank.
Yeah. And if you had to recommend, I guess you've read hundreds of books over the course of doing the podcast over the last 5 years, 1, 2, 3 books that would be relevant, not just to this room, but to anyone, what would they be and why?
That's a very hard question. Depends on what you're interested in, but big impact to the question we had here about distraction. I love the book Deep Work by Cal Newport for 2 reasons. One is it's super important to get into flow in the work that you have, so to block time to do that deep work, but also most people are distracted, so if you become the deep worker in your environment, that gives you a serious edge up on other people. And the other book that I would recommend, we just interviewed Matthew Dix, who wrote Storytelling. And storytelling is a great gift that you have to make compelling arguments in your environment, especially in a busy environment that we're all in. and a largely remote type environment. So those are two great books I would highly recommend.
CFA Research Institute has a book. I think it's just called Financial Market History. I don't know if people have read it. Incredible book. I think everybody should read that. I find we get a lot of interesting perspectives from podcast guests, but I find the deep historical perspectives on data and what has happened in the past in financial markets, I find that to be really interesting. But that's a book that captures a lot of that in terms of asset class returns and market structure and things like that. And then the other one is also historical. It's The Great Depression, a Diary by Benjamin Roth.
Oh, yeah.
Which is it's a first-hand account from a lawyer who lived through the Great Depression, but he's journaling about what's happening in his life and what he's thinking about and how he's processing the information. And it's just an absolutely incredible perspective to think about today, which is why it's an interesting book.
Great. How are the two of you different, other than your interests and other than maybe height? What is?
I'm 6'3" and I'm tiny, right, in this group.
I'll say, when we took the picture, I was like, okay, I'll at least be his height. And I was like, no, I'm not his height either. But we talked about complementary skill sets a little bit last night. And I think we've gotten into that. But how do you complement each other? And is there anything that you don't complement each other that gets on your nerves about the other person when you're in a room interviewing people for 5 years?
Go ahead.
These are the hard-hitting questions.
I don't think we get on each other's nerves very often. I'm probably more analytical than Cameron.
Probably.
That's probably the biggest difference, though. I mean, we share a lot of the same interests, and even if I'm more likely to dig through academic papers, Cameron's just as interested to hear the conclusions as I am.
Yeah, so I get what comes out of his research. I just don't have the drive and the intellect to dive into the papers like you do. I think you can live easier in a world of chaos, I think, a bit more than I can. I mean,
well, he has 4 kids.
Right? Like it's part of the. It may come off like it's polished. There's a whole lot of duct tape in behind the scenes, right, to pull this off every week. But the commonality is the drive, right? Like we're just curious. We're not 9-to-5ers. We're bouncing ideas off. I've chilled a lot. Like we let a lot of stuff go. Like some things I may have disagreed on, like the length early on. Stuff like that. We just, because no one knows the truth, right? So we're happy to experiment. He didn't know if the book review was going to be of interest. I didn't know either. Yeah. Who knew if it was going to be goofy next to his deep dive? Does it work? Well, we'll let the listeners be the judge, but it's kind of what we like doing, right?
Yeah. 5 years in, hundreds of episodes. Do you have an idea of when this would stop? Or do you envision doing this 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now?
We don't quit very well. I think that's a trait of ours. As long as there's good research and interesting authors and stuff to think about, I don't see why it would end.
We're enjoying it. I think and that's one of the things in thinking about pursuing a podcast for somebody else. You've got to enjoy the work and the whole process. If it got to a point where we weren't having fun or weren't enjoying it, we probably would stop. But we're not there, so it's I don't know when we would stop.
Yeah,
eventually, but I don't know what the driver behind that would be.
Okay. You talked briefly about regrets and not having video on the first 100 episodes. Anything else that you know now that you wish you knew 5 years ago, 3 years ago?
No, it's super fun to play around with ideas and try stuff and see if it works and see if you enjoy doing it. Like so much of it's an accident, right? Like even deciding, do we have a guest? Do we have a guest every other week? How did that cadence happen? Early on, we tried to do Ben's deep dives together. It quickly became evident that doesn't work. So let Ben do his deep dive. He's great at it. And then we changed the order of the show. So it's a fun recipe to mix with. It's super creative, too, to actually put something as a finished product out and see what like our marketing team does with it afterwards. Because once we're done recording, they own it, right? So they get creative on the graphics on the video and the engineering behind the scenes.
Okay. I've just been flashed the 2-minute sign. You guys know how you end each podcast or each interview with a guest, but some of the people in the room will not. Each time they have a guest on, they conclude the interview with asking that person, how do you define success in your own life? So I hope you're prepared for this question after 270-something episodes.
I'm not, but it's easy for me, like, to be around people that you're crazy about and love going to work. Like, every morning, like, Lisa will say to me, she's like, I can't believe you're so happy to go to work every day. Like, we jump out of bed like at whatever 4:03 in the morning. I can't wait to get to work.
I'm not prepared for this either, and I've thought about it.
This was not on the list of prepared questions, to be fair.
We always put that on the list for the guests so they can think about it
I
beforehand.
should have added that. I apologize.
We've heard however many 100+ people,
Yeah.
very accomplished people, answer that question, and there's so many different ways to answer that I think are pretty great. I don't know if I have one that's unique or particularly good. I think you got to enjoy what you're doing minute to minute, but you've also got to be able to reflect longer term on what you have done and be happy with that. So I guess that's something like that, enjoying what you're doing moment to moment, but also being able to look back on the bigger picture and be happy with where you're at.
It's pretty good, I'd say, for
That's
not
pretty good
prepared.
answer.
Yeah. Any closing thoughts for this room of people? Obviously, there's some people thinking about starting a podcast. There's a lot of independents. There's people that work at banks here. Any advice based on what you've learned or based on your careers at PWL?
Keep on learning every day. That's what Chris Hatfield told us, right? Like, it's not about being an astronaut. It's about becoming an astronaut. It's every single day. So in this business, right, just keep learning and helping and get better every day.
Content has been, we talked about the growth of the podcast. The growth of our business has kind of mirrored that. And the content has been an important part of that. So if you can do it, if you can pull it off and be successful creating content, I think it can be really valuable.
Absolutely.
It's not, other than our time, I guess, which is maybe expensive, but it's not particularly expensive. Like, we're not buying Google ads or paying for advertising otherwise, but we're getting massive reach with our content. And it's pretty incredible for a lot of different reasons. But if you can pull that off, if you can be consistent with doing something like that and build a community around your content, I think it's extremely valuable in our business.
Great. Well, I have not got to all my questions here, but it is 12:40. People have not had lunch, so we do need to cut this off at some point. I want to thank both of you. Again, I'm the first person to ever host a Rational Reminder other than the two of you over the last 5 years, so that is an honor as a longtime fan of the show, and just really appreciate you guys being here today.
It's great to have you on.
Thanks a lot, Scott.
Thank you.
All right, so I hope people enjoyed that. And now we're going to move on to our Mark to Market segment with Mark McGrath. Mark, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks. Yeah, always good to be here. It feels like it's been a while, but
it is. Yeah, it's been a while since we've recorded because we had a bunch of, Cameron and I were traveling, and so we had a bunch of pre-recorded episodes, and it's been a different experience than usual.
Much super less, weird. Like we're out of sync on this completely. Yeah. I think.
Yeah, totally.
Bit of a gong show.
Yeah,
that's good.
Yeah. So what do we got this week for Mark to Market?
What do we got? So I'm going to talk through some of the concerns that I think a lot of people don't know about when it comes to a certain type of account called an in trust for account or an ITF account. Sometimes these are called informal trusts. So these are accounts that were traditionally, they were opened at a bank branch, and it's a way to convey money to a minor child or grandchild, right? So take a scenario where, let's say you're a parent, you're funding the RESPs, the education plans for your kids. That's all going well. You've got additional money that you want to put into your kids' hands, but maybe it's not such a significant amount of funds that you're going to go to a lawyer and draft up a formal family trust, right? Maybe it's 10 or 20 or 30 or $50,000 or something like that, where the lawyer fees to draft a formal trust maybe don't make sense in the context of the amount that you're going to contribute for your kids. And so there's this type of account called an ITF account or an in trust for account or an informal trust account. And it is an option. And the way these work is you open it at a bank, or you can open it with an advisor or a brokerage, and you contribute money. The child is the beneficiary, so they're the only one that can benefit from the funds. You contribute the money, and then you manage it on their behalf. And the reason you might want to do this, or the benefit that at least is sort of marketed and sold, is that if you invest that money inside an ITF account and you generate capital gains, so you invest in something and it goes up in value, those capital gains can be taxed in the child's hands, not in your own, right? So the alternative usually is you have the money in your own non-registered account, where any capital gains you're going to pay tax on, presumably at a higher bracket than your 3-year-old child who hopefully does not have a job and is not earning an income, right? Now that's great Any other types of income like interest or dividends or foreign dividends, those do get attributed back to you, the contributor to the account. So this is really sold as a way to invest the money for your kids, target capital gains, trigger capital gains over time in their hands. They're likely not going to pay any tax on it. And when they reach the age of majority, the funds are legally theirs. So you get to hand it off to them, and now it's their money. So on the surface, that all sounds great. There's a number of things that can go wrong, and these are often not set up correctly when you look at how trusts are supposed to work. So first of all, CRA does not distinguish between like a formal trust and one of these accounts. So in the eyes of the CRA, a trust either exists or it does not, full stop, right? Now, for a trust to exist, it has to meet certain tests and definitions. And usually if you go to a lawyer, you would have a formal trust deed prepared, and it would be very clear that these definitions and terms are being met, and there's no issue with that. The problem with these ITF accounts is often that certainty is not clear from the paperwork that you're using to open up the accounts. Because when you go in and you open one of these, it's just like a new account application form, similar to opening, say, a TFSA for yourself. And so you can run into these issues. And one of the big ones is something called the reversionary trust rules. And that's a fancy term that basically says if you're the trustee of the account and the contributor or the settler of the account, you can run into an issue where CRA says, no, you didn't actually give this money away. It looks like you did, but you're still in control of it because you've contributed the money, but you're still in control of it as the trustee. And so we're going to revert all of the income, including the capital gains, back to you. And the issue is this might not happen until many, many years down the road where you've already triggered capital gains in the hands of the child. And CRA goes, no, we're going to look at this as if this trust never existed. And so now you've got all these back taxes to pay because you were putting those capital gains in your kids' hands, but actually they're yours. And not only that, but because some of these tax bills are retroactively due 10 years ago, now there's a bunch of penalties on top. So it completely undoes the trust relationship and can be a pretty nasty surprise. Now, I've never seen this happen like in practice, but in theory, this is a possibility. And so one of the ways around that is to ensure if you're going to open one of these accounts, the settler or the contributor and the trustee are two different parties altogether, right? So you might have, let's say, a father be the contributor or the trustee, and the mother or the other spouse, the partner, being the other party, right? So there's a separation between who's contributing the money and who's controlling it. So that's one way around it. Now, that's only one of the issues. Some of the other issues arise if one of the parties passes away. And this is something that I've never seen discussed or considered when these accounts are recommended. So if you think about it, let's say there's three parties. There's the contributor, the trustee, and now there's the beneficiary. What happens if one of these parties passes away, right? So if the contributor passes away, from a tax perspective, that's actually the best case scenario, because from that point forward, there's nobody to attribute the income back to, because they're gone. And so the only party that is now responsible for any tax is going to be the beneficiary. So if the contributor passes away, even the interest and the dividends, which normally would be attributed back to the contributor, are taxable to the beneficiary's hands. So obviously it's a terrible scenario, but at the same time, from a tax perspective, not a bad thing, right? Where it starts to get messy is if the trustee or the beneficiary passes away. So if the trustee passes away, the trustee's will determine what happens next. If they have named a new trustee for it, like a subscriber trustee, then it will pass to this new trustee and they'll continue to manage it. I have never seen a will where this was done. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, and maybe there's some great planning going on and people are doing this, but I've never seen a situation where somebody had one of these ITF accounts and their will named a subscriber trustee. So if they don't, it goes to the estate of the trustee. Okay. So back up a bit because it's starting to get messy. The trustee passes away. Now the estate of the trustee is effectively managing the trust account for the beneficiary. But guess what? The executor of the trustee might be somebody totally unrelated, or somebody that the contributor wouldn't want to elect to actually manage these trust assets, right? Like maybe you named a friend and the contributor is a grandparent or something who doesn't know this friend, but now the executor has to manage the money, and it may be completely different than the wishes of the original contributor, right? So you get into these kind of strange offshoot relationships. So that's potentially one problem. The other issue is if the beneficiary passes away, then it also gets pretty messy. Obviously, they're a minor in this case. It's not likely, but it does happen, unfortunately. Because minors cannot execute a will, if a minor passes away and they're the beneficiary of a trust, there's no will. And so it follows the laws of intestacy, which is just a fancy term meaning this is what happens if you die without a will, right? And in that case, the parents would typically get the first share of the assets in equal shares. So now imagine a situation where a grandparent opens one of these trust accounts for their grandchild. If the grandchild were to pass away, the money would revert to the parents. So the grandparents have now completely lost control of this thing. They no longer own the money. It's now been given to their parents. And maybe that's not the end of the world, but at the same time, that's probably not what the original intent was for opening these types of accounts. So those are the sort of major issues, I would say. The other ones are, once you gift to one of these trust accounts, it's irrevocable, right? You cannot take it back out. And if you do, you end up with problem number one, which is that reversionary trust concern. You can't even take it out to contribute to an RESP for the child, because technically an RESP is owned by the subscriber. It's not the beneficiary. So you can't go to a trust and realize you should have gone to an RESP. Sorry, you're now reverting the trust, which can get pretty nasty. And probably one of the bigger problems is that when they turn 18 or 19, the money is legally theirs. I don't know what you guys were like at that age. I know what I was like at that age. I can tell you right now, it would not have been a good scene if I knew there was a bunch of money. Suboptimal is a polite way to put it, Cameron, for sure. That money would be long gone. I'm not sure I'd be here talking to you guys right now. And some people I do know, I've got clients who have kids who are financially mature enough to handle that type of windfall, but the decision's now out of your hands, right? If they find out about it, it's legally theirs. And if you don't give it to them, they can actually sue you as say the parent or the grandparent to get the money. So it can get kind of nasty. So that's how they work. That's the downsides of them. What can you do instead? I'd say the easiest thing is just consider the RESPs first, education funds for your kids. If you've maxed those out, you can look at other things like just paying their expenses directly during their lifetime. Let's say it's a grandparent opening it for a grandchild. Rather than put money in trust, just pay for their activities, their private school, their sports, their arts and activities and that type of thing. And when they get older, you can help them fund a tax-free savings account. That's really simple. You just gift the money, and as long as they're 18 or 19, depending on the province, they can fund a TFSA. Another option is life insurance. For some people, that might be reasonable or something to consider. And so I do want to point out that these things can work. They can be great tools for people. I'm not totally against them by any means. I just think people need to consider some of these risks and downsides before they just sign an account opening document for them.
Well put.
Yep.
I think that's it.
Yep. Interesting topic.
Cool. Yep. All right, guys.
All right. Thanks for the mark to market.
Thanks, guys. See you in a couple weeks.
Mark.
Cheers.
All right. Always great to have Mark join us. Great information there. So let's jump to the book review section. So once again, I discovered a great book. I enjoyed it immensely. It's called Creating Superfans, How to Turn Your Customers into Lifelong Advocates by Brittany Hodak. So I reached out to Brittany to see if she would join us, and she agreed to come on. And much like the last marketing book we talked about, which was Nancy Harhut's Using Behavioral Science in Marketing, well, that's really applicable. And I know there's a lot of business people listening to us who I think will appreciate this book. Anyways, Brittany is an award-winning entrepreneur, author, and customer experience speaker. She's delivered many keynotes around the world to companies such as American Express and organizations like the United Nations. She's also worked with some pretty cool brands and entertainers like Walmart and Disney, Katy Perry, Dolly Parton. And I really liked her book, so I reached out, invited her on, so she came to join us. I thought our conversation was terrific, so this is our conversation with Brittany Hodak about her book, Creating Superfans. Brittany Hodak, welcome to the Rational Reminder podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Congratulations on your new book, Creating Superfans, How to Turn Your Customers into Lifelong Advocates. I got to tell you, our head of marketing and our listeners know Angelica. She saw you speak at the Jolt conference earlier this year, and as you were speaking, she downloaded your book, texted me that I've got to get this book, so I downloaded the book right away, I think as you were speaking, and then I reached out to you immediately after diving into the book to have you come on, so it's great to have you join us.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that, and I'm thrilled to be here.
So right off the top, what is a superfan?
A superfan is a customer who's so delighted by their experience with you that they come back and they tell their friends. They become what I call an enthusiastic advocate.
What is a brand?
So a brand can be a person, it can be a thing. We are living in a world where all of us are essentially brands. And one thing that I want people to really know and understand, especially when you have employees, is that your brand is your team. Oftentimes we think our brand is our logo, our website, the ads that we place. But in reality, our brand is the people on our team and the interactions that those people are having with our customers. Because a brand is really just what someone thinks about when they think of you. And more often than not, unless your brand is like, Disney or Amazon or Nike, people aren't thinking about your logo. They aren't thinking about your campaigns. They're thinking about the interactions that they have with your teammates and the products that you sell.
A couple of weeks ago, we had Matthew Dix join us, who wrote the book Storyworthy, and he talked about the power of storytelling. That was an incredible conversation we had. Now, you wrote in your book that superfans are created at the intersection of your story and every customer's story. So how do superfans relate to the company's story?
So it's important to know that it's not just the company's story, it's also the stories of everyone who works at the company, because much like the Chicago Bulls and Michael Jordan, they are intertwined because, as I said before, your brand is everyone that's working on your team. So in the book, I talk about using the power of storytelling to set yourself apart from your competitors. I think the biggest threat that every business faces, whether you're a brand new business or one that's been around for centuries, is apathy. Customers who just don't care enough about you to have a strong opinion one way or the other. They see you as a commodity provider. So maybe they'll give you their money, or maybe they'll go to a competitor. They're probably going to be making a decision based on a commodity factor. What's the closest? What's the fastest? What's the least expensive? And by using storytelling, by cementing yourself as a category of one, you begin to chip away at some of those commodity things. You begin to make things like price and speed a little less relevant, because people say, but I want to work with them because they're the best. And the quickest and the most effective way to do that is through storytelling, because stories are much more impactful and much more memorable than the things that we sort of like to think rational people are using to make decisions. Things like, facts and statistics and all of those sort of, scientific, logical, quantifiable details. But every single research study that has ever looked at this has shown that storytelling is much more powerful, much more effective, much more memorable than all of those things.
Do you have any sense of what causes apathy in a business? Is it that lack of stories that individuals carry?
Part of it is that, and I think it's really lack of differentiation. So for a very long time, we were living in an economy where it was service-based or product-based, and you could do okay competing on commodity things because people weren't able to get everything they wanted at the click of a button on Amazon. So if you were the closest to a bunch of people, if you had convenient hours, like, you would do okay. But the world has changed, and now everything is available in the click of a button. You don't have to click a button. You can search with voice to get what you want. It's never been easier for upstarts to use technology to level the playing field in many ways with much more established competitors who have been around a much longer time. And because of all of those things, it has become increasingly important to set yourself apart with things that are not based in commodity, because it is easier for a customer today to have apathy than it ever has been before. Like back in the day, you maybe had to, put effort into remembering, like, what was the name of that handyman? What was the name of the person who came and did something for you? You'd put their card on the refrigerator so you had it. Now, if you forget that, you can just do a search and find a ton of people who are nearby who can come help you solve that problem. So it has become easier for customers to have apathy because the access to information to find other people who do something very similar or perhaps exactly the same as what you do has never been easier. So in order to set yourself apart, in order to turn those customers into superfans, you've got to overpower that apathy. You've got to make them want to say, I don't want to work with someone else who does what you do. I want to work with you because you're the best.
That's really interesting. You were speaking to this, but I want to ask about it explicitly. Why are superfans so important to building a successful business?
So superfans are important for a few reasons. Number one, they help bring you more qualified customers. So they are out there advocating on your behalf when given the opportunity to do so. That could be in person at a baseball game or a supermarket. It could be online. It could be writing reviews, talking about you in a post that they're putting on a social network or a blog or in an email blast. So they're bringing you more highly qualified prospects, and there's a trust factor of those prospects who come in. The other reason that they are important is because they are going to have a much higher lifetime value, and they are going to come back much more regularly than other customers, because they've solved this problem. They're no longer looking for like, oh, I need somebody else to clean my carpet. I need somebody else to, fix my car. They're like, oh, I found someone. This is great. I don't have to solve this problem again. I don't have to do another search 6 months from now when I need something else. I have found a really great solution.
In addition to characteristics about the business, are there characteristics about the person that cause them to be active in advocating for a business? Like, is there something that, I've wondered this for a long time, because we often have clients that will be very active referrers to our practice. Is there something about that personality?
Yeah, so these typically a superfan is somebody who likes to be helpful. They're very social. They want to help other people. They oftentimes are either extroverted or very connected in their communities. So these are the same people who are helping with suggestions and recommendations for things that aren't business related, right? Like saying, oh, let me tell you about this class your kid needs to take, or let me help make dinner for you because you're overwhelmed, or let me help drive your kids to the practice. Which the really great thing is, we all have these people in our lives. We all know the people that we can go to for a recommendation that seem to be over connected, that seem to over index in their ability to help us, or like whip their phone out and say, oh, I know exactly who you should call or who you should talk to. And in the world that we're living in, increasingly, everyone is an influencer. Everybody has the ability to post things online, to share opinions that will change the way somebody thinks about, because we trust their recommendation. We trust their input. We trust that action. So yes, these are typically customers who have strong social bonds in their community, are trusted within their peer group or their friend group, and like to make helpful recommendations. They like that sort of social capital they get when they say to somebody, oh, try this new restaurant, or go here, do this. And somebody has a positive experience based on that recommendation.
I never thought about that before. That's interesting. So it's much easier to be an advocate now than it was, say, when I started in this career 25 plus years ago.
Oh, absolutely. Because we are all carrying around computers in our pocket where we can share our opinion. And, the really interesting thing about the connectivity that we all have with social networks now is, if you think about the posts that go viral on a regular basis, a very, very small portion of them are from professional creators. Those people who are spending all of their time trying to create viral content, trying to do something that's going to catch on. That is a very small fraction of what actually goes viral. More often than not, it's an average person who shared an opinion that resonated, that overpowered that apathy that we all have, that made people say, oh, I want to share this. I want to tell somebody about this. I want to have this reach other people so that they have the same reaction to it that I did, whether that's a positive or a negative emotional reaction. And so that's when when I talk about this idea that everyone is an influencer, every single person has the ability to have your opinion heard by every other person on the planet. It's a really wild sort of social experiment that we're all living through together right now.
How can a superfan be created?
So superfans are created, as I mentioned before, at the intersection of your story and every customer's story. And I have spent my career obsessed with trying to figure out how people can create some science around the art. What can we do? How can we make someone go from, in my book, I talk about this idea of the ladder to super fandom and all of the different steps along the way, from getting somebody to be aware of your product, to trying it, to actively adopting it, to showing some sort of affinity for it, all the way up to the final rung of the ladder, which is advocacy. And in the book, I talk about, each of those rungs on that ladder and sort of what it looks like and how you move people up. But ultimately, the process that I recommend, the system that I write about in this book, is a 5-step formula that anybody can look through this lens to think about how they turn more of their customers into superfans. And I call it the super model.
So if one of our team members meets a new prospective client, how does that person determine what their customer story is?
So the super model is, S stands for start with your story. And really that's all about getting clear on your own uniqueness. What is it that you do that makes you deserving of superfans, both from a company level and also as the individual who's working there. So getting real clarity on what sets you apart. Why are you not a commodity provider? Why should someone choose you at the exclusion of everyone else? And then the second part of that, you understand your customer story. That's where the question that you just asked comes into play. What can you do? So in the book, I offer sort of a secondary framework for really, truly understanding your customer story. Teddy Roosevelt said, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And I think that is so fitting here. Really asking the types of questions to uncover what transformation your customer is looking for. What is it that they need both on the surface and below the surface that you may be the perfect fit to help them with? What are they struggling with that you're able to come alongside them and say, hey, I'm the right person to help you solve this problem because I have helped other people who are where you're at by. Like, what are those stories that you're telling? And then the questions that you're asking are really to help uncover, what reservations do they have? What is it that they're looking to come out the other side of the tunnel with? What are those things? So asking those questions, leading with empathy so that they feel that they are not just another prospect, not just another sale. They feel that real human to human connection, that they matter to you as much as you and what you do matters to them.
What does it mean to say that we're living in an experience economy?
So living in an experience economy means that we're no longer in a market where things are driven solely by the product or the service. Those two things have long since blurred. According to a PricewaterhouseCoopers study, 86% of people are willing to pay more for the exact same product or service if they know they're going to have a great experience. Experience is everything. It's the number one differentiator between your brand and every other. It's the number one thing that allows you to build loyal customers, to increase your profit margins. That experience is so critical. But in an experience economy, the inverse of that is true as well. Experience is everything, but everything is experience. Every touch point, every interaction, every single time a customer is in front of your brand, whether in person or online or on their mobile device, that is part of the experience. So in an experience economy, you've got to look for all of those moments where you can win, where you can elevate something from ordinary to extraordinary, where you can take it from, a neutral experience to a positive one that they're likely to remember and maybe even tell their friends about.
And think about the flip side of that. How is this affecting customer expectations?
Oh, customer expectations are constantly getting higher. And part of it is because everybody else is raising their game. And part of it is because of technological advances. People don't just compare you to the best experience they've had with your direct competitors anymore. They're comparing you to the best experiences they've had anywhere. And as we see innovation, as silly as it sounds to say, the Domino's pizza tracker, right? things like that have become so ingrained in the like pop culture zeitgeist make us think we should be able to have the same access to that information and those experiences regardless of what we're doing. So when a small business says, oh, I don't know where this is at, or I'm not sure how long it's going to take, oftentimes the response is not, oh, that's fine, because this is a new company or a small business. It's, if Domino's can tell me who's putting mushrooms on my pizza right now, and Lyft can tell me exactly how many wrong turns, my driver has to take before they get to me, why can't you tell me where this thing is? The technology exists. So in a customer-driven experience economy, expectations are constantly rising. And this is important for business owners to know, because you should always be innovating before you have to. You should always be making things easier and more frictionless for your customers before your competitors do, because what was good enough 3 years ago is not going to cut it today. And even if you're like on the cutting edge today, in a few years, the things that you're doing now that might seem really innovative are going to be table stakes, because technology has made it so easy and fast for people to catch up to the category leaders.
How important is a team versus an individual in winning new business?
It's incredibly important, because everyone is in the experience department. Every single person, regardless of your role, you're shaping the perception that prospect has of the company. So it's critically important for everyone on the team to understand not just their piece of the puzzle, not just their role, but really how it fits into the bigger picture. And again, why someone should care. Like, what is the thing that every one of you is doing collectively, but also individually, to earn that new business, to be the right partner for that prospect?
In your book, you wrote that the best marketing doesn't cost anything. Can you talk about how businesses should think about their investment in marketing?
Yeah. So what I mean by saying the best marketing doesn't cost anything is when you have word of mouth, that's free. When you have people out there advocating on your behalf, that's free. And oftentimes when we think about marketing, we think about, the paid things that we're doing, either the campaigns that we're running, the creative that we're making, redesigning things. And in reality, if you can spend a little bit of money to do things that make your customers happy, that make them more likely to tell their friends, that make them more likely to come back, you're going to see much higher ROI on that. And some of the things that matter the most to customers, things like, kind words and handwritten notes, and being able to take the time to talk to them, to understand what it is that they're going through, to help them out, those don't cost anything at all. And so making sure that you're giving everyone on your team permission to do those things, to look for those opportunities, to connect on a human level, to do those sort of high touch things that can't yet be automated, to help increase the affinity that someone feels for your brand and generate some of that reciprocity with those prospects and customers.
Love it. Love it. The book is Creating Superfans, How to Turn Your Customers into Lifelong Advocates. Brittany, it was awesome to have you join us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great talking to you both.
Thanks, Brittany.
All right, I thought that was great. Brittany's great. She's a podcast as well that's really entertaining that I listen to periodically. So welcome to the Aftershow. Ben, I think it's safe to say you enjoy traveling quite a bit now and meeting lots of other people.
Wow, let's slow down here. I enjoyed meeting lots of people. Do I enjoy traveling? Not that part. Hotels, no good. Airplanes, no thank you. Getting back home and sleeping in my bed and actually having a good night's sleep for the first time in however many days was great, but all worth it to spend time with lots of like-minded people at all of the different things that we've been at recently.
Okay, so let me amend what I said. So the travel, maybe not so much, but you enjoyed the people and the destinations. I mean, our trip down to Southern California was it was incredible where we were. The weather was fantastic, and we had a chance we actually had a meetup for some really interesting people, interesting collection of people that were at the conference that listen, like our good friends in the industry that listen each week. But we also had some other guests just come and join us. Like a new friend of ours flew down from Seattle to meet with us, which is pretty cool. And we also ran into Mayor Statman before that breakfast, which is pretty fun to run into Mayor.
Yep. Yeah, that whole event was very cool. And I met everybody, like everybody that I know from our podcast and from the internet and from Twitter. Like everybody was there at that conference. So I met a lot of people in real life that I have known on the internet for a while. That was a really cool experience. Yeah. And then when we were in Toronto, that was also incredible. The CFA thing that everybody just listened to earlier in the episode. But then we also had the Rash Reminder meetup in Toronto, which was also incredible. We'd have room packed with podcast listeners and hearing from everybody the impact that the podcast has had on their thinking and their life and their decisions. It's like, kind of surreal to hear that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and like I told many people, the consistency of the audience, because we've had 5 of these now, and just the interest level, the kindness, the love of learning, the love of sharing, just the love of coming in and sharing this common bond with people. It was a pretty incredible event. We must have had at least 30 people in Toronto.
Yeah, at least. If you count people coming and going, it was probably more.
Probably more. Yeah,
maybe 30 at a time for a couple of hours.
Yeah, super fun. All right, do you want to dive into these reviews that we got on Apple?
Sure, yeah. Jay Snedeker from the United States says that the podcast is fascinating and insightful. I discovered Ben through his YouTube channel and quickly rushed to listen once I heard there was a podcast. I have not been disappointed. I work in wealth management in NYC, where many professionals are unfortunately solely focused on investment returns and miss out on other valuable components of advice that Ben and Cameron address almost every episode. I just finished episode 267 on the expected cost of pessimism and the value of storytelling. I will be sharing with all of my colleagues. This podcast is true financial education. Thank you. Very nice. Thank you.
Cool. Keep going, and I'll do the LinkedIn ones later.
Okay. Bachcast from the United States says excellent information and discussions. Great resource for a wide variety of topics, and from financial planning to living a happy life to nerdy discussions on investments. I really appreciate Ben and Cameron's scientific and humble approach to new information and subjects. Their curiosity and willingness to suspend preconceived notions instead of just lecturing the audience is a breath of fresh air in the podcast space. PNW Matt, also from the United States, says, fantastic podcast. The hosts deliver a wide range of practical, high-quality interviews and summaries. I'm consistently amazed by the caliber of their guests. I listen to a lot of podcasts, a couple of hours a day, and this is the only one where I immediately move every single episode to the top of my playlist. I can't recommend this podcast enough. Very nice.
Very nice.
Words people write about us are just, like I said earlier, it's like surreal. It's crazy.
But I will agree with that last comment. The caliber of guests has been great.
Yeah.
On LinkedIn, I heard from some pretty interesting people. Shilash from Toronto reached out saying, great podcast. I've been a long-time follower. Helped me transition from being anxious and unsure about path of financial planning to being relatively competent and confident, as Chris Hadfield stated. I've not only learned about financial management, but life lessons and how to plan for a good life thanks to your podcast covering a range of topics. Guests have been awesome. Top advice which we give. I've been meaning to share this with you for some time, but thanks to your nudge in a recent podcast, I now send a long overdue thanks and appreciation. Keep up the great work. Brian from Windsor reached out, said that he was at the CFA event and enjoyed it. Alex from Montreal reached out, saying he's a huge fan and that have great admiration for the work that we and the team do. Side note to that, Alex asked to connect to talk about the industry, which is always an open offer out there. So we're going to be talking soon. Fatir from Mississauga, thanks for connecting. Love the podcast. Sanjam from San Francisco, thanks to the amazing podcast. Big fan, watching religiously for the last 3 years. Farouk from Edmonton, new listener, found it via your conversation with the Plain Bagel. And was captivated by the recent episodes, so decided to rewind the tape back to episode 1. They're on episode 20 now. Nathan from London, who was also at the meetup that we mentioned, been a dedicated listener for the past 3 years, and I've heard you mention several times you enjoy connecting. So we did connect, and it was great to meet Nathan. Why don't you mention this email we got, Ben?
Yeah, I just wanted to real quick before the email, you reminded me of in the Roush Reminder community, there's a section where people can introduce themselves. And somebody did that recently, and I just wanted to read out what the last part of what they said. So they talked about why they joined the community and what they want to learn, all that kind of stuff. But what is their favorite Roush Reminder episode? And this, I just thought this was interesting and very cool. So their favorite podcast episode is episode 1, the first one. And we always talk about this, how it's always crazy to think about how people go back and listen to the first episode. So their favorite episode is episode 1 because it was cool to listen back to the origins of the podcast and to see how it has grown so much into the community that it is today. So that was cool. And then special mention to the episode with Cliff Asness, episode 99, which, yeah, that was a great one. And then they also wrote a thank you. I'm so appreciative of RR, the podcast, this forum, and the community. It truly feels like a mecca of investing with so much knowledge, quality discussion, and filled with so much warmth and respect among members to boot. I've already tremendously benefited from this community and have spent hours and hours reading through many rich discussions. I haven't stumbled upon a place quite like this before, but I'm really glad I did. Thank you. It's nice, right?
Mm-hmm. It's true. And you see that when you meet these people. Like from London to Ottawa to Toronto to California to Montreal. Like, it's such a persistent trait that you see. Yeah, it's impressive.
Okay, so the email. Hi, Ben and Cameron. I've been a listener for a few years now and have been meaning to write for a while. I want to say thank you all so much for what you do every week. I believe that what you provide listeners is a real service to living a better life and to living a better financial life and a better life in general. The material and guests you have had on the podcast about happiness and money have made me realize that actually spending more money now is something I should do. Having always been a super saver, you'll help give me the confidence to relax my savings rate and spend more money in the present, while also feeling safe and confident about my financial future. If I lived in Canada, I would love to work with you guys at PWL. Thanks again and take care.
Very cool. Coming up next week is the episode that we recorded in California with Hal Hirschfield. Hal killed it. It was so much fun being there with Hal.
Yeah, he was great.
And then in the coming weeks, we have Professor James Grubman coming up. And also Shane Parrish will be joining us for a full episode talking about his new book, Clear Thinking, which was just released. Also want to mention again, we don't mention it very much lately, but the 23 and 23 reading challenge is still going on, of course. Super easy to join. You can visit rationalreminder.ca and click on the tab if you want to join. The books are just, I don't know the current totals, but the people are just crushing books in there, which is so good to see. Had a number of people actually at the event in Toronto mention that they do appreciate the book challenge and the book reviews that we do. And people were really writing down actively the book recommendations that we did give. So there is interest in that. Kind of puts pressure on to make sure we choose good books. But I've heard that a number of times over the past 2-3 weeks as we've been meeting lots of listeners. But it's been super weird few weeks, right, with the travel, and like we're kind of out of sync on us episodes and guest episodes, and so forgive us. It'll be a little bit messy for another month or so, I think, before we kind of get back into our regular routine.
Everyone's going to be okay.
I think so. But it is weird for us as with the travel in and out of the office, and both of us have had other travels too. So it's been a pretty incredible 5-week run here. Anything else, Ben, on your mind?
No, I think we're all good.
All right. Thanks everybody for listening.